participants in, and a few more I'm sure will be coming in soon. So let's get going. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third session of the 2017 Research Methods Division Consortium. Today, we'll be looking at the issue of ethical issues in data collection and reporting. I'm delighted to say that we have three outstanding panelists whose work I'm sure you're already very much aware of. Let me start by introducing the three. Professor John Antonakis is Professor of Organizational Behavior at the University of Lausanne, and I apologize for mispronouncing that. He received his PhD in Applied Management and Decision Sciences at Walden University and completed postdoctoral work at Yale University. John's research interests include leadership, charisma, psychometrics, research methods. He's also the current editor-in-chief of Leadership Quarterly. I also noticed this morning that John has a Wikipedia page, which I think is possibly the highest honor that we academics can achieve. Second, we have Professor Hans Hansen. He's an associate professor of management at Texas Tech University. He's also the Embry Rights Fellow at Southern Methodist University. Hans received his PhD from the University of Kansas. His research interests are broadly related to meaning making and the methods to inquire into those meanings. His research topics include ethno-narrative methods, narrative theory, institutional theory, aesthetics, and abductive inquiry. Third, we have Professor Andrew King. Andy is the Professor of Business Administration in the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. He received his PhD from MIT. Andy's research examines self-regulatory institutions and business in the natural environment. Andy is a founder of ARCS, the Alliance for Research on Corporate Sustainability, which serves as a vehicle for advancing rigorous academic research into corporate sustainability issues. Similar to last week, we'll go in the order that I introduced the participants. So John will go first. He'll speak for 10 to 15 minutes. We'll then open it up for questions. We'll then do the same with Hans and then with Andy. If we have a couple of minutes at the end, then we can ask general questions. All right, I'll leave it to the presenters. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Just tell me if that's okay, Craig. Can you see my screen okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that looks good. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I guess you've all received the article that I had asked to be distributed on doing better science. And therein I explain about certain diseases that threaten the viability and the usefulness of research that's currently conducted. I took a very broad look at this problem, not only just on leadership, but in organizational behavior, in management more general, and also beyond, looking at other social sciences, but also the hard sciences. Obviously, this is a metaphorical way in which I'm using this terminology, and the body of knowledge here that has a problem is the body that has a problem is the body of knowledge, I'm talking about it now from an editor's perspective, but I'll also talk about how we as authors can help to correct this problem. So these diseases exist because of how collectively we go and we conduct our science, the conditions under which we do our science, and then the incentives that we receive from journals, research sponsors, and universities. So I'm going to just quickly talk about these 5 diseases, then I'll talk about what symptoms and consequences we see from these diseases, and then I'll focus quite a bit on the lack of rigor, what I call arrogorium, and how it causes problems in how we do our science. So the first problem that I've noticed, and is something that has been repeated quite often, is the problem of significosis, which is the incessant focus on producing statistically significant results. So what happens is the distribution of effect sizes that we should see are truncated just near the 0.5 mark. So anything that's not significant doesn't get published. So this gives all sorts of perverse incentives to authors to get their results published. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the biggest problem by far is that the distribution of effect sizes is very biased, which means that we may over or underestimate some effect, which means that we cannot inform policy properly because of this pervasive problem of publication bias. The second problem that I identified is called neophilia. That's the excessive appreciation for novelty and for snazzy results. So typically journals ask that results are new and novel and add something different to the research record. Now the problem with doing this is that sometimes we may not keep our eye on the ball, in the sense that we publish stuff that looks very interesting but is perhaps not rigorously done. So for example, one case that I highlight is the problem of power posing, which was a fantastic and amazing finding that Amy Cuddy and her colleagues discovered, that you take a power pose for a couple of minutes and that can increase your endogenous testosterone, risk-taking, and make you more leader-like. Now, man, this is incredible if this result were true, but it turns out it wasn't. It turns out the authors confessed to p-hacking. It turns out that it could have been a fluke, and it turns out that it could have been due to a demand effect. The researchers were not blinded to which condition the subjects were in, whether they took a power pose or a very subservient pose. So, the problem is, in science, we are here to publish the truth and not spectacular but possibly flawed results. And neophilia is something that sometimes clouds our judgments, puts blinkers on us, and we don't really look at how the basic research has been done. Another problem we have is Theoria. So as the word may trigger images of gonorrhea or diarrhea or other bad areas, this is a mania for new theories. So typically speaking, journals request that we update and extend theory. Now this is quite an interesting thing. Suppose we took the 5 top journals in management, each publishing 50 papers. That means we have to make 250 contributions to theory just to those journals per year. Now think about physics, which is one of the most theoretically developed disciplines that we have. They can make very precise predictions, yet their theory changes only very slowly. Every 5 to 10 years there might be some change to the fundamental way in which physics is seen. So the problem again, by having to invent theories, is that people will fit theories to data or results that they already know. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And that also squashes the exploratory or abductive research, because many times we might find something just by chance alone. For example, the case of anesthetic, which is arguably one of the most important discoveries for science. It was discovered by chance in an exploratory way, number one. Number two, they still cannot explain the mechanism. How does anesthesia work? How does it put people to sleep? They don't know that. But the fact that we don't know that doesn't mean we haven't identified a causal effect that's properly, correctly, and causally identified that can affect policy. So, before we can start to explain causal mechanisms, we need to identify causal effects. And the problem is we often put the horse behind the cart. One of the problems that I'll talk a little bit more about today is the lack of rigor in theoretical and empirical work, which is hugely problematic. If we want to inform policy, we need to know whether changing X affects Y. If we're not sure that changing X affects Y, we shouldn't be in the business of writing papers which imply or insinuate that doing more of X will change Y, because how can we possibly inform policy if the change in X affects Y, not because it's because X that's affecting Y, but because there's an omitted cause that we haven't modeled. So in other words, the correlation between X and Y is due to a third variable. And the last thing is, because of all these incentives, because we have to defend a territory and be known for something, we have what's called disjunctivitis, a collective proclivity to produce large quantities of salami-sliced, redundant, trivial, and incoherent work. So we don't move forward like in economics, which has, for example, some theories and common assumptions, or in physics. So we don't move forward in a paradigm-driven way, but we each try to defend our own little territory. We don't reach out to other researchers, other models, other disciplines to build cohesive theories. So because of all these things, we see p-hacking, people throwing out data to make it significant. Now, sometimes they do this explicitly, sometimes they do it implicitly. There are all sorts of post hoc justifications that people can use to make the results significant. You know, throw in a control or take it out or invent a new control or what have you. So there are a lot of questionable research practices, I'm not going to get into this, that have been written, but the whole problem that's driving these things is because of our fetishizing of significant results. We have hacking, hypothesizing after the results are known. This all leads to the suppression of replication studies. In medicine, it's really important that a study is replicated many times before we know if the effect holds. In our journals, very often we frown upon replication studies. Now, this is starting to happen. So my journal, for example, where I'm editing Chief Leadership Quarterly, we accept replication studies. We accept null results. But if a journal is only keeping an eye on new results and on significant results and on theoretically contributing results, all this stuff can never happen. And if it doesn't happen, we have biased distribution of effect sizes. And for me, that is very unethical. We are wasting taxpayer dollars to finance research that is meaningless or is not very meaningful for policy. And at the same time, basic research is not well regarded. I mean, I published a paper in 2009 in the journal Science. Now, science, as you may know, nature, whatever, you got to discover kind of water on Mars to get published on there. And the paper I published was very simple. We showed little children could predict the results of election races merely by rating the faces of the winner and the runner-up. Now, this has very profound implications for democracies, for voting, for stereotyping in many, many areas. Hans might talk a little bit about this with respect to the death penalty and how the look may affect whether one's probability of getting sent to the death chambers increases. But I didn't have a theory at that time to explain this result. We made some suggestions about how evolutionary mechanisms may have selected certain phenotypic signals which perhaps relay some credible information about the target concerned. But at the time, we had no idea what was causing the result. Now, many people have done many experiments after this, and I have a paper that's coming out any day now in Current Directions in Psychological Science, where we try to explain this finding. But certainly in 2009, when I published the results, I had no idea about what was the theory behind it. It was very basic research, and that can have very profound implications. Now, all this engenders crises, lack of quality research, distrust in research, because we have replication crisis after replication crisis, and especially research that's not rigorous cannot be relevant for practice. So just to give you an example of one thing that has kind of slipped in unnoticed, and no one's really questioned it. Another problematic area is studying power. So those of you who may know about the typical power prime manipulation, where we give to the treatment condition instructions to do, for example, the following: please recall a particular incident in which you had power over another individual or individuals. Please describe the situation in which you had power, what happened, how you felt. So this is what the experimental group gets. And then the control group is told to write about what they did yesterday. Now, think about this. We have an asymmetrical demand effect. The control group kind of knows what the experiment is about. Now, if you ask them to answer questions on power-related themes, because a script has been triggered, being in a position of power, they will respond in a demand-driven way. Now, the other group, the control group, who wrote about what they did yesterday, they have no idea what the experiment is about. And of course now, you're going to find a significant difference on anything you ask them later on, especially power-related themes, not because they truly felt powerful, but because of a demand effect. Now, it's incredible that dozens and dozens of papers have been published by this research group, and many people have replicated this result. But if the result is driven by the fact that there's an asymmetry in the demand effect that's correlated with the treatment, we can't really know what's going on. And then people do inconsequential tasks like, hypothetically, would you do this, or hypothetically, would you do that? You know, it's one thing doing demand-driven research and asking people hypothetical questions in hypothetical conditions. It's another thing observing people in situ, doing a task which has trade-offs, wherein they incentivized, for example, to look at their personal interest versus the the public interest. So in another paper that I wrote with Sturm in the journal Management, we're really pleading for the use of consequential research designs, particularly turning to behavioral economics, which has made a lot of inroads in understanding decision making, but also in situations where there are trade-offs between public and private interest. And for example, the question on power is something very interesting, and we published a paper recently in the Leadership Quarterly where we do show that power corrupts, and testosterone, which we had pre-measured, also accentuated the effects of power on corruption. So all these problems are big. For example, on the problem of arrogorium, we did a review paper in 2010 published in the Leadership Quarterly where we found that leadership researchers fell to address, pardon me, there's a little word missing, up to 90% of design and estimation conditions that make causal claims invalid. So this is very bad, and we replicated a similar result that was published in strategic in the journal Strategic Organization, which looked at papers published in SMJ, in the Strategic Management Journal. A follow-up review looking at all the papers published in LQ, we found that 79.73% of articles had at least one or more endogeneity threats, again, which means that their results can't inform practice. In a paper that just came out now in Journal of Management, we looked at process models, how process models are estimated. And to estimate a process model, obviously you need X to be exogenous. You have a mediator and its effect on Y, but we found that only 26% of articles used an exogenous predictor. All the others used an endogenous predictor, which again doesn't help, because if the predictor is not exogenous, you cannot lock in the causal direction of the effect of X on Y through M. And we found that only 2% of the papers that had studied a process model used an instrumental variable estimator. So for example, when M is measured, it's endogenous, and it means it could correlate with a disturbance in Y. So the only way to estimate such a model is to use what economists call IV, or instrumental variable estimation, which can be done through maximum likelihood or two-stage least squares. So anyway, to cut a long story short, because of all these issues, we have huge problems in research, and this can't inform policy. So, we're trying to change that. I, as an editor, have changed the editorial policy at LQ in the hope that we can attract better quality research, but also to change the distortions we have in the research record. We might see some theories falling. We might see some high-profile questioning of certain theoretical trends. But at the end of the day, I don't care about publishing sexy and snazzy results. I care that we report the truth. So I, as an editor, and you as authors, we all are in this boat together. Reviewers also matter too. So hopefully these methodological questions will be more on your radar, so we can all help to correct the status quo. So that's all I have. So do I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, so you're good as you are now.
Okay.
So we everybody, thanks very much, John. That was outstanding. So what we'll do now is, for those who have questions, I'll ask you to type those into the chat, as we've done for the last couple of weeks. John, while we're waiting for some of these questions to come up, I wonder if you have any general advice for some of the participants. So about 2/3 of our consortium participants are graduate students. Do you have some rules of thumb for people that can help them to try and avoid some of these 5 diseases?
Oh, well, I mean,
it's difficult.
Yeah. Well, firstly, you should try to publish your work in journals that are open to publishing registered reports, for example, where you give in a proposal, and the proposal that includes the introduction, the literature review, and the method, that's reviewed first. That's critiqued, updated, revised, and then once that's approved, authors gather the data, and then the results are published no matter how the cards fall. So, supporting journals that have this open mind with respect to how to change the publishing game is one step that they can take towards to help us. Another is informing oneself of the latest trends and tendencies in research methods. So, what you're doing and the consortium and ORM is something that will help us, because methodologists typically know about these issues, and and they're on our radars way before applied researchers consider them. So really a lot more of understanding, methods advances. I think that can help as well. So maybe those are two things, because I see a question has come in. So
okay. That sounds great. Feel free to go with the questions.
Okay, so I'm going to read the question aloud. It is very difficult to find a proper IV. The regression results with an improper IV are more misleading. When is it most impossible to find an IV that meets all the IV requirements? What is your suggestion? Okay, well, first thing, yeah, it is true that if you do use IV estimation, the cure can be worse than the disease. In other words, OLS regression results may be better than IV results if you have bad IVs or bad instruments. If you do have an exogenous instrument, then typically you are on safer ground, even though you might have more variance in your estimate. So where to find proper IVs and correct IVs? Well, the natural place to find them is in an experiment. So typically speaking, when we test process models, if we can do it in an experimental design or in a field experiment, if we randomize subject to conditions, then we have the best IV possible. No one can question the exogeneity of a manipulated variable. And then if we measure M1, M2 up to Y, we can estimate the causal chain. In the paper that I wrote on making causal claims, a review and recommendations, which some of you may know, I'm just going to quickly pull up the reference and put it in the chat room.
I just put it in the chat.
Ah, you did, okay. That's the paper. We do explain other places in which we can find instrumental variables. So an instrumental variable mustn't change when there's a shock in the dependent variable, in other words, in the disturbance. So imagine, for example, for some reason, my subordinate is more or less performing, okay? So there's some shock that changes their performance. Will that correlate with my modeled regressor? If my modeled regressor is my working memory or my IQ, no, it will not. My intelligence will not change if my subordinate one day is more or less performing. So theoretically, the smarter I am, the more I understand condition action scripts, the more I'm a better strategist and I use my expertise and experience to help others, the more they can perform. So I can estimate the causal effect, for example, of intelligence on performance. So many individual differences which are genetically determined, for example, intelligence has been estimated to be up to 70% genetic. And by the time people are 30, 35 years old, I mean, it's pretty stabilized, not going to change. Personality is pretty much exogenous, mostly exogenous. I mean, gender, if there's no selection on gender, that can easily be used as an instrument. Age can be used as an instrument. There are other geographic variables that can be used, distance from the sea, latitude. So there are many different ideas. If you'd like to look at the paper on making causal claims, we provide some ideas. Okay, so I'll go on to the next question. So on making causal claims, you state that economists pay attention to the test of fit and don't report failed models acceptable. Why is this approach not fully embraced in social science? Yeah, that is a really important question. So I'm actually working on a paper right now on this. It's in the second round of review in a journal. It is very unfortunate that the over-identification test is ignored in our field. Now, the over-identification test, also known as the likelihood ratio test, or also known as the chi-square test of fit, looks at the discrepancy between an implied model and the data. And the bigger the discrepancy, the more likely the model did not generate the data. The problem is, and we know this analytically from mathematical proofs, that if you fail the chi-square test, it's very likely that your parameters are very biased and not truthfully mimicking what the true data model generated. Now, one of the reasons why a slew of, let's call adjunctive fit measures were invented can be found in a telling anecdote by Carl Joreskog, who was the inventor of Lisrel. And Doug Sorbom, his collaborator, once was asked, why does Lisrel have CFI and GFI and RMSEA if the only thing that matters is chi-squared? And Doug Sorbom said that users threatened Carl Joreskog to stop using Lisrel if Lisrel rejected all their models. So that's why they invented goodness of fit and all these other measures, and other people created them. So there's a lot of controversy with these measures. We know that they are very dependent on sample size, on loading strength, on collinearity, on many things, and they simply cannot be trusted. So I think one challenge that social science researchers have is to go back to the drawing board and rethink how they do measurement. We've had these, received doctrines about how we should measure personality from, research that was done in the 60s and 70s when we didn't have the best statistical tool, and then these things still prevail. And of course, they're going to get rejected by modern psychometric tests. So, I really think that people have to bite the bullet and move forward so that they do research which pays attention to statistics. Okay, so we have another question from Jeff Gish. Hi, Craig. These links take me to a site at Notre Dame.
Yeah,
okay, you fixed that. Okay, sorry. For junior faculty who have tenure requirements, particularly in A journals, what recommendations do you have to still publish but to avoid the 5 diseases, or is this simply a research ethics issue? Well, it's both. But I think if one designs one's research study very well, has a relatively large sample size, has a clean manipulation or a clean instrument, what economists or people in strategy call a clean identification mechanism, I think that's what at the end of the day journals are looking for. I also think that journals now are more open to publishing the research that's done that's informed from economics. I mean, I must say myself, about 10-15 years ago, I had a problem explaining instrumental variable estimation, and I've had many articles that were rejected at very, very good journals, not because the articles were not good, but because the method was not understood. But I think more and more now you'll see that AMJ, Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Applied Psychology, they are starting to publish articles that use these methods, and I think they look at these articles in good light. I think strategy has been more ahead than we have, especially SMJ. If you look at it, they've made many advances. So I would just say embrace more rigor and pay attention to clear causal identification and mechanism. Argue about that, because more and more people realize that causal claims are important, and having a properly causally identified model is important. In an article we wrote on what makes articles highly cited, we showed that the collective market discounts work that is endogeneity plagued, and it pays a premium in terms of citations to articles that are clearly causally identified. So shoot for that. Okay, how not to get caught up in the crossfires of ideological battles in the method domain. For example, PLS to be outright rejected as they are valid method for small n, and the decision whether one should do it fixed or random effects is effectively not a statistical issue but a conceptual one. Okay, I can talk about both those issues because I've written quite extensively on them. So PLS, as done now, has got a big problem. So even the inventor of PLS, Herman Volt, could not prove the sampling distribution of the PLS algorithm for calculating the weights. So this is something that's known. One of the students of Herman Volt published a paper in the Journal of Econometrics about 20 years ago, and he himself proved that PLS is an inconsistent estimator. So everyone knows this. Now, PLS, people have tried to fix the problem by introducing something called consistent PLS, but that still has some intractable issues because it relies on a sampling distribution that's unknown. So it has problem with over-identification, it has problem with estimating the standard errors directly, so there's no observed information matrix. So this is not for me an ideological issue, it's a mathematical issue. If one can't prove analytically that an estimator is consistent, that it approaches the true population value as the sample size goes to infinity, then one shouldn't be in the business. That's what Granger said, a Nobel Prize winner. So for me, this is not an ideological battle, it's a mathematical battle. If one can prove something analytically, I'm happy to buy it. But as long as something hasn't been proved, then the doubt is on the person who's making the claims, not on the person who's skeptical about the claims. As for random or fixed effects, it's not a conceptual issue. It's a conceptual issue on the point that if you want to understand how a level 2 variable may affect a level 1 variable, you conceptually may want to study that. But if you haven't measured all the important level 2 variables that matter, then the estimator may be inconsistent. So that's why the default estimator that economists use is a fixed effects estimator, because we know that with a fixed effects estimator, any level 1 variables, their effect on the level 1 dependent variable is going to be consistently estimated. Now, in the causal claims paper, if you can take time to look at it for ight, is it ight? Arjit. We talk explicitly how one can use a hybrid estimator and estimate at the same time level 2 effects and partial out the fixed effects. So Mundlach wrote a very influential paper in Econometrica a couple of decades ago that proved that. So there's no more quibble, or there shouldn't be any more quibble between people who say we should use random effects and people say we should use fixed effects, because we can use a hybrid estimator that partials out the fixed effects so that we can add in the random effects. So at the end of the day, as one becomes more informed in the mathematical bases of these issues, I think one can avoid setting up these discussions as ideological ones, because it's really very far from that. It's mathematical arguments with mathematical proofs that should matter at the end of the day. Craig,
John,
tell me.
I wonder if you could maybe find one last question that you think you'd like to address, and then maybe we'll ask to wrap up there.
Okay. Well, there's some very interesting questions. Maybe when I finish my exam, I can come back on and answer them by email or by in the chat room. But let me see. Is there a trade-off between significances and Theoria? Well, I don't think so. It is true that, well, maybe there is. I think there should be no trade-off between these diseases. I think if we do basic research that's well done and rigorously done, and if journal editors pay attention to the evidence and to reporting the truth, whether the truth leads to null results or not, that's what we should be caring about. It's reporting the truth and not spectacular and sexy results. So that's all I have to say.
Great. Well, everybody, please join with me in thanking John in the chat for a fantastic presentation and some intriguing work. I feel it's fair to say we could have listened to you for a lot longer than 30 minutes. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm in the middle of an examination, and I have to go back down into the lab. It's an exam on causal claims. It's the causal analysis class that I teach.
Good luck, John.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we'll move to Professor Hans Hansen now. And Hans, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be joining you. And please don't hesitate to ask questions during my presentation. I'll just tell you about I'm here probably because of an interesting research setting, but because we're a research methods group, I'll lead up to what came out of this research setting was really a method, a new method, I think, is a standalone method. So my setting is I live in Texas, and I design and build death penalty defense teams, and I built a permanent team in Texas, and we have grown. I did a 6-year ethnography in this setting from the point that the team was initiated until we grew to cover all of Texas. We actually cover, there are 254 counties in Texas, we call them, and we cover about 245 of them. But if there's a death penalty case in Texas, that is the client of my team. To get the death penalty in Texas, you have to kill 2 people, a police officer, or someone under 6. And just to answer, Jonathan asked a question of, does your appearance determine whether or not you get the death penalty? The quick answer is yes. And that appearance is skin color. In Texas, the death penalty, and in the United States, period, the death penalty is used almost exclusively to kill Black and brown people who have killed white people. So the most important factor in determining whether or not someone gets the death penalty is race, but in not a counterintuitive way, but the race of the victim is the most important factor in determining who gets the death penalty. Meaning, if someone white is killed, they seek the death penalty. If someone Black is killed, they do not often seek the death penalty. And I guess we can say this is the social status of the victim. When a police officer gets killed, they will stop at nothing to kill the defendant. But if a drug dealer is killed, no one seeks the death penalty because it's very expensive and very time consuming. And the implicit logic is that someone who is not very important has been killed and their lives are not worth as much as someone of a higher status. The second factor is the race of the defendant. And there's countless studies that show, and you can look at the makeup of people on death row. In Texas, it's about 70% Black and Hispanic. And the Black population, for example, in Texas is 12 to 14% of the people. And it's out of the discrepancy is that out of all the crimes committed that are eligible for the death penalty, the ones that are pursued are the ones where the victim was white or high status and where the defendant is Black or Hispanic, some minority case. And then there are other factors like money or whether or not the DA, the district attorney, is the person who decides whether or not to seek the death penalty. If they're up for re-election and they're tough on crime in their campaign, they're likely to seek the death penalty. But what's important here is that justice is not. So my setting, I got involved in the setting with a cold call. I had no interest in the death penalty before I got this phone call. I am from Texas and I live in Texas, but the death penalty is not something that I thought about a lot. I was probably against it because it was politically correct to be against it, but it just was not something I encountered in my everyday life, so I did not think about this issue much. I got a call out of the blue from someone here in West Texas, and they were going to establish a new type of team. Previously, I understand we have an international audience, but I'm sure you know on TV that when you're charged with a crime, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. We've seen these on cop shows or US-based cop shows. So that does happen. And in Texas, previously, death penalty defendants were given ad hoc court-appointed attorneys. But for the first time, the team that I designed was going to be a permanent death penalty defense team. And its purpose would be that we would get only death penalty cases, but all the death penalty cases in Texas. So it would be a specialty group similar to a DA's office who's in charge of prosecuting all crimes. We would be in charge of defending against the death penalty exclusively. So the topic that I'm going to talk about today that came up in designing this team is compassion. And so there's an important stream of research, a pretty recent stream of research called compassionate research or compassionate organizing.
Hans, sorry to interrupt here. Are you meaning to show us slides? We can't see slides at the moment. If you aren't, it's fine, but I just wanted to check.
I'm going to get to it just momentarily.
No worries. Just checking. Thanks.
So out of this setting, what I want to talk about today is something called compassionate research methods. And compassionate research basically talks about three aspects. It's that and I think it's important for researchers because I guess the frame I want to put on this is that researchers should be seeking to intervene and reduce suffering in the world. Compassionate research is a touchstone for that because compassionate involves noticing that another is suffering, empathizing with that subject, and then third, you attempt to alleviate the suffering. So that was prominent. I don't want to talk about, I'm happy to answer death penalty questions, but I think we really want to talk about research methods. So if you're into the concept of compassion, which involves, again, noticing suffering, empathizing with that suffering, and then attempting to reduce that amount of suffering, then we should have some kind of method that researchers can do that with. So I'm going to share some slides now, and it's just from a paper. And I don't want to go over slides the whole time, but it will just give you an idea of this methodology. And it's just some screenshots from the paper. So the paper is titled, "This is Going to Hurt, Compassionate Research Methods." And the reason it's titled that is because that second part of the concept of compassion is empathy with the sufferer. So if you're empathizing with someone who is hurting, you're also hurting. All right. There's some definitions of compassionate right there, and at the University of Michigan is really where a lot of this research has originated about compassion. And they developed an ASQ article called Compassionate Organizing, talking about how an organization can show compassion by shifting resources. But there's the definition of compassion there and some of the sites for the foundation of this field. What my co-author and I, Chris Quinn Trank, sought to do was to build a method. Instead of just studying compassionate situations, we sought to distinguish ourselves by providing a method so that researchers could reduce suffering in the world. And here's the basic model of compassionate research methods. You use ethnography, which looks like a very traditional ethnography, aesthetics, because aesthetics looks at felt meaning, so that parallels nicely to compassion's empathizing, and then also emotionality. And there, I think emotionality in research is a big trend. I think at the Academy I saw a PDW on emotionality and ethnography. So you combine those three to intervene in a context where suffering is occurring. And two things happen. You have up here you have the goal to alleviate the pain, which is part of the compassionate model. But I also think that because new lenses allow us to see things a new way, we might generate new theory that if we theorize on ways to reduce suffering in a specific context, that might be generalizable to help us theorize about how to alleviate suffering elsewhere. So that's the idea of compassionate research methods that came out of this death penalty setting, where part of it was that I was attempting to reduce suffering, not just of the defendant, but we found that everyone was suffering in this setting, that the jurors, the DA, that it was a highly institutionalized session, a highly institutionalized context with a lot of pressures all leading to execute someone. And full circle, the defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, juries that I talked to, all were experiencing some type of trauma or suffering. And of course, our goal was to stop the execution. And some of our results have been that before I got involved, and this is quite staggering, in West Texas, when the state of Texas went for the death penalty, they got it 98% of the time. Overall in Texas, the rate for death penalty trials is that the death penalty is given out over 90% of the time. Where I started, it was 98% of the time. Since my team began, only one person has gotten the death penalty. We have stopped over 100 executions. And here I just have one more slide, kind of methods related, that compares traditional inquiry with compassionate inquiry, just so that you can compare some of the themes. Even a lot of ethnography can be objectivist if it came out of an anthropological tradition. So we compare that instead of a traditional arm's length inquiry, that this inquiry is subjective and that you're attempting to intervene rather than observe from a distance. So that's I'm going to stop sharing the screen, I guess, unless I have requests to continue to share the screen.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Hans. So let's open that up for questions. I imagine there's a wide range of questions that we could ask on this. Can I start with just the same thing that I asked John? Considering that most of the participants in this consortium are graduate students, some are deciding on dissertations, some are coming to the end of dissertations. The remainder are generally pretty junior in their career. Do you have some concrete advice for people in this position, especially those who would like to start doing a little bit more with compassionate methods, maybe positive organizational scholarship?
Yeah, it does come out of positive organizational scholarship. That's a good point. I do have some concrete advice, and it's bad advice, but I think you should follow it. Well, I'll let you decide if you should follow it. I think there are some conceptions about qualitative research that apply to PhD students and junior faculty members. One common perception is that it takes longer to publish, and more we're under pressure to publish or perish and produce by the time we come up for tenure. So it is often people advise against doing qualitative work or work that's meaningful to you until after you are tenured. That was not the case for me. So I pursued qualitative research. I was quantitatively trained in my PhD, but became attracted to qualitative research. I tell people, generally I tell my PhD students, if you want to find something, do quantitative research. If you want to say something, do qualitative research. If you're interested in making an impact or generating new theory, then qualitative research is the most plausible route. But it does have its challenges to the time consumption and tenure and the perception you'll have. So I think most people would advise, I've heard this advice that you should wait until you're tenured to do something you really want to do. But I think that's bad advice for your soul. It's probably good advice for your career, though. But I want to say that maybe both are possible. Maybe you could focus on doing, be strategic about the research you engage in. But I do want to promote more compassionate and interventionist research. I think if you are interested in qualitative research and you're interested in doing something significant or making a difference, in the Academy of Management, the past 10 years have had, I think 8 out of the past 10 years have had some kind of thematic connotations of research should make a difference, or we should do what's important, or we should do what matters. But then all our institutional pressures argue against that. So I think by providing a compassionate research method, it allows us a way, I hope it becomes a legitimate way to do research that matters, that's significant to us.
Okay, I think we have a couple of questions starting to come in on the chat. Hans, are you able to see the chat where you are?
I sure am.
Okay, great. I'll leave them to you then. The first one I think is from Kylie Rochford.
Okay. All right, so this, the method is, I'll tell you, the common questions for compassionate research would be the same as for qualitative research. And still I get comments about, is one setting enough? Although that issue should have been put to bed. If people think about case research, they often want multiple cases, but single setting ethnographies, I think, are still a terrific way to generate theory. So all the questions I get from reviewers or critiques are still the same that qualitative researchers have battled for far too long. And I don't want to spend many time going over those responses, but there are plenty of responses to critiques of qualitative research, and plenty of citations to help you if you're going to submit qualitative research for why it's valuable. I will say one thing. In the 90s, when you saw qualitative empirical papers where there were real settings, and this is just something it's arbitrary, but I think it's meaningful, this page count on how much space is devoted to justifying a method. So I used to see qualitative research in AMJ and ASQ. They'd present the method, and then there would be 3 pages justifying why qualitative methods were appropriate or useful. And I think now that has gotten down to just a paragraph. So I guess we can take that as hopeful that this battle has been fought by others, that we don't have to justify qualitative research anymore. But the common questions I still get are still related to those methodological questions, not anything specific about the method, but just about the value of qualitative research and the common critiques we see of it. Okay, there's another question about, let me try to combine some of these. I guess there are some about if we're doing research that kind of makes a difference or that informs policy, are there any do's and don'ts? I don't know of any do's and don'ts. I think if you're hoping to inform policymaking, you start to be an advocate. So there are questions about advocacy research. I think I would point to John Van Manen. He wrote an article called "You Got to Have a Grievance," to where he promotes advocacy ethnography. And I guess also Denson mentioned there's been several movements in ethnography. And the latest movements have been towards advocacy ethnography, to where you hope that your research makes a change. And that's kind of away from a dispassionate observe and describe, that we hope. I think that's a bias that we can't get over, that if we're conducting research that we hope to just describe and observe and report, I think that's still valuable. But I think advocacy research, policy research is becoming more acceptable. In fact, it's made it, I see a lot on advocacy ethnography as a substream of ethnography now. Okay, there's a question about emotionality in research. I think that my comment on using emotions in research, yes, you use the emotions of subjects. I think that has always been true. And then there was kind of a stream called autoethnography that became important about 5 years ago. But I think what really I think that stream has kind of waned, because I don't think that people could retain the difference between ethnography and autoethnography. I think emotions of the researcher can matter as an additional, I say this, emotions are data too, that you should treat it like any other data. It's an observation, it's just an emotion-based observation. So your reaction to your observations is kind of another layer of data that can help you inform your research. So my quick answer for dealing with emotions in research is that we should do it. I don't think it's a big deal, and that I think we should consider that emotions are data. Okay, I see that someone just saying that they noticed that the methods section devotion about legitimacy is something they've seen before. That's good to hear. Someone wants to hear about I have a Bori asking about, can you share how you went from quant training in your PhD to qualitative methods? Yes, I can. So like most of you probably, we were pretty heavily trained in quantitative, but I also took a course on philosophy of science, and I teach a course on philosophy of science now. And we basically compared positivist research with post-positive or postmodernist research. And really, kind of post-positivism kind of led me to a new way of thinking that opened me up to qualitative research. And I knew that's when I think the kind of ontological questions with positivist research, I think a book I can point us to is Lincoln and Guba from 1985, that those made a real impact on me about questions we have about the biases in quantitative research, and some stuff that John talked about he calls them the diseases we have, but I think those are some biases we have. But I think also post-positivism has given us a critique, and then postmodernism has kind of given us a lens. And I think that although it's a critique, the methodological ontology, or I guess the methodological assumptions, the epistemology that most closely aligns with postmodernism or post-structuralism is qualitative research. So that was the movement for me, was an attraction at the ontological level that led me to a new epistemology and a new method. Okay, another question is, can we integrate compassionate inquiry with leadership research? I think so. So I think if you want to look in leadership research, compassionate methods work anywhere where you see suffering. And it doesn't have to be someone facing an execution to be suffering. I think when we have this movement, if you're familiar with the dark side of organizations, or with inappropriate workplace behaviors like bullying, or leaders who are bullies, if you see suffering in a setting, and let me also say this, I think quantitative methods could be used to reduce sufferings. I think there's a challenge to the second part of a compassionate lens, which means that you have to empathize with those who suffer. So that's why in our paper, we kind of align compassionate methods that we think are most appropriate for qualitative settings. But if you are in a setting where you see suffering, I think compassionate methods can be applied. So I think in leadership, if we take a follower perspective, for example, or where people have a lack of leadership or where there's toxic leadership, that a compassionate lens could be a great way to integrate compassionate inquiry into leadership research. But the first criteria is, does the site include suffering? And I think if we, the root of compassionate research, Peter Frost said that there was suffering is pervasive in our organizations, but it's not an aspect that we look at. And I think if we look at that aspect of organizations, it could generate a lot of new theory because we're looking at new phenomenon.
And I think that was most of them. There's just one other question, which you partly touched on, but you may want to say a little bit more about. It's from Sri. Sri says, thank you for the great work. Are compassionate research methods a type of action research? Isn't it two strikes against those, qualitative and action research? Maybe you could talk to that.
I think that's correct. I would say it's interventionist research because you're seeking to change, just like action research, that you are seeking to change the setting. And that became I want to question why that became a rule for us, that we should not seek to, I have an idea about where that assumption came from, that as researchers, we should objectively observe and only describe. And I think it became from a positivist assumption that when you study something, you don't influence it. But post-positivism has showed that when we study something, we influence it anyway. So if we're going to influence it anyway, why not try to make a positive impact or have some kind of change it for positive? Because I think it's a naive assumption to say that we can study something without changing it. So I am for intentionally change, and a broad goal like reducing suffering shouldn't be objectionable to those. So my answer is that I think it happens anyway, that we change the things that we research, and that we should get over the presumption that we shouldn't be changing. I think action research is appropriate. It might lead to more practical theories, and I think being an interventionist is appropriate. But I agree with you that that people have critiqued that, and it could put strikes against you, for example.
Okay, thank you again. I wonder if everybody would join with me in thanking Hans in the chat for a fascinating presentation. I was just saying offline to Tim Quigley that sometimes there's a little bit of work in these consortia, but they're the most fascinating things to listen to. Okay, well, we'll move on now to Andy King. Andy, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so first of all, I should thank Craig for inviting me to this, and also say that research methods and research design is something I've stumbled on over time. And my training in this is, I'm definitely self-taught. So I come at this, I think, with some, maybe more my experience than training. And again, if you guys want to jump in and interrupt at any moment, please do. Okay, so let me just say a few things, and then maybe we can, maybe that'll allow us to have a little bit of a conversation. First of all, it's a difficult time to be a PhD student or a junior faculty member or a faculty member. I mean, as you all now know, there's lots of evidence coming up about false positives and results that were p-hacked or were accidentally obtained. Everything from, female hurricanes kill more people than male hurricanes to the next one on there is the Reinhardt-Rogoff evidence of the debt levels and GDP growth. Amy Cuddy's been mentioned before. Lower left-hand corner, I've done some work on disruptive innovation and how reliable it is. There's the P-curve analysis from the p-hacking guys, and my own work that came out in SMJ on the number of the possible false positives, or at least studies that wouldn't be able to be replicated easily, and which we call scientific apophenia. And on that topic, I have to say that I have really no right to give advice here, because I have done what the members of this cartoon are doing, which is to see a pattern where none exists. And that is the definition of apophenia. Apophenia is a sort of a disease. And what's ironic about this picture, or amusing possibly about this picture, is that someone is seeing a pattern in a pizza. He's in a neurology canteen, which suggests two things. One is that he's knowledgeable about neurology, but the other one is that he may have been using fMRI studies, where again, people were seeing all kinds of patterns for long periods of time, only to realize that they were adding those patterns to the data. So this problem of sort of finding patterns in data is a big problem. It goes all the way back. It's evident, awareness of this goes all the way back to Francis Bacon, and the sort of founder of the scientific method, who talked about how people tend to find more order in the world than it really exists. I also have, I think, no real right to be very judgmental, because, I have engaged in some of the practices that are now criticized. I think we have to recognize that there's a lot of research. The Peloton has had some problems for years, and, we shouldn't be pointing fingers too much. And I won't go through this in great detail, but I think I could go through every one of my papers and say, there's a problem. The brand new paper I'm publishing, we were encouraged to try to come up with a mechanism for the underlying effect that we had. And, we found it ex ante. We essentially fished it. And we didn't hypothesize it. We pushed back against the reviewers and didn't add it in as a hypothesis, but it's definitely something where we found it after the fact. And as you can see, there are problems all the way through, everything from sort of conceptual problems to failures of my own to understand the underlying mechanisms or underlying statistical corrections and so forth that I could use. There you go. So problems. We've all had these problems. And these problems are really hard to overcome, because we want to find something, we want to believe it. Once we get the ideas in our head, we want to see those in the data. It's really easy to fool yourself. And if you haven't read it before, Richard Feynman's story about the measurement of the charge of the electron is a great study that sort of shows the kind of problems you can run into. So what can we do? So I have been trying to develop a set of steps for thinking through our research. And my goal would be to teach these to, not so much to PhD students, but to MBA students, as a means of having them better understand how to analyze and think about evidence as they move through their lives. And let's just start right from the beginning. As I've been doing this, I've been going back and thinking, okay, so what is the reason we do, what is the scientific method? What's the problem of induction, all the way back to David Hume? Why do we have this disconfirmation idea? What's Karl Popper talking about? And what is deductive? I had to go to look up, what's deductive as opposed to inductive? So the first thing is, my tests would be, is there a theory? Is there a logically valid theory with premises and conclusions? So, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. So you've got two premises and a conclusion. And it's valid because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And it's not tautological, that is, that it always is true. And it's bounded. It talks about humans. And so that would be sort of step number one. And then step number two is it connected to a valid epistemology? And so there are various different epistemologies out there. I mean, and a big one is sort of the difference between the Bayesians and the frequentists. And the frequentists, I would say, follow very much from a kind of Popper tradition. And the idea is this, that you create a deductive argument, and then you find out whether it can be falsified. And if things are never true, but as long as they've not been falsified, they're not yet proven to be true, false, and so therefore we can go on using them. It's a way around Hume's problem of induction. And the Bayesians have a different one, although they're in some ways similar. And you should have, theory should have that. There should be a logic for how you're going to take data and make an inference from it. And I would argue that something like blue ocean strategy, which is a very popular theory in the management area, fails. It's actually, when you work out a truth table for it, it's tautological. And so, and it can't ever really be then tested. So already, I think we can think through what we're working on and we can say, does that succeed or does that fail? And then you can move on to that, does your empirical design have sound constructs, cogent measures? How do you have a theory for how you select counterfactuals? And by the way, if you haven't read it, James Heckman has an article which I will post afterwards about how induction should occur, and he tries to go beyond just randomization to other approaches. And one of the things he talks about is the importance of theory in selecting what the counterfactuals are. And then you have a logical approach to inference, identification, strategy, threat to inference. And if you think about it, the problem is that, and this is what David Hume pointed out, if you roll a ball and it hits another ball and the ball moves, that's not necessarily a proof that the first ball caused the second ball to move. You need a counterfactual, which is, had that ball not been hit, would it not have moved? And the problem is you can't do it on that ball at the same moment in time. So we have the next best thing, which is a randomization process. And that's our inference strategy. Is instead of we're going to have one ball hit another ball not hit another, but similar ball, and we're going to see whether we can then infer from the differences. And so therefore we have an application and we have a way of testing our theory. And I would argue something like disruptive innovation doesn't have that. The whole logic that Clay Christensen and Paul Carlisle lay out for how the study should be created is from a series of case studies where you continually modify the underlying theory. And so I think there's actually a missing sort of element of an empirical test or an empirical design then. And then on from that to, how is the empirical practices done? Were there ex-ante rules for data gathering, results viewing, and analysis stopping, analysis extension? And I've run into this a zillion times. How do you actually gather the data? How if you strip a website, are you getting all the data, some of the data? You have to think about the selections over time. What's the underlying population we're drawing from? What's the representation of that, the representative in that? As you're doing your results, should you be checking the results as you're going along? Should you be waiting to the end? When do you stop analysis? You can imagine if you had doing something like a drug discovery, when you decide to stop is a really critical thing. And you have to have some of these, it's best to have these set up ahead of time. Have I done that? Very, very infrequently. I'm starting to try to do it now, but it's something that's good to do. And then obviously the separation and explanation of ex ante and ex post. Again, in this most recent paper I'm publishing, we really pushed back against the reviewers who wanted us to actually hypothesize the mechanisms that we found. And that would sort of suggest that they were ex ante developed when in fact they were found after the fact. They're ex post. So being very clear about what's ex ante, ex post. And then finally, exposition. Is it comprehensible? Is it conscientious? Are you following good reporting etiquette? I think Tim Simcoe's rules are really good. And is it practical? And I would argue having dug very much into the power posing literature that was mentioned earlier that was done by Andy Cuddy and Dana Carney and some others, that they ran into a problem here, that they actually, I think, had a good theory, a good empirical design. They had a randomization design. I think they mostly engaged in good empirical practices, but they were overstated the degree to which the data could be used and extrapolated from. And had they not, I think there wouldn't be a problem. All data is, all studies are going to draw from a distribution. I don't really believe that studies are either right or wrong. What we're doing is we're kind of gradually getting a better estimate over time. And if their study had been viewed that way, I don't think it would have been a problem. I think the claim was that it's going to change your life, then set them up for a problem with this last one. So sort of modesty and care in your exposition, I think, are very important. So this is my version of what Tim talks about. Tim Simcoe, again, if you want to Google him and you look for his etiquette page. I think the first thing is when you're doing work, you should have a logical approach to inference. You should have a theory of how you can draw inference from your data. Then, and I think almost all of us will be thinking about randomization as an approach, then you should think about the ideal and practical experiment. So what is the ideal experiment you would have run had you been able to do it? So, for example, in my most recent paper on acquisitions, the ideal experiment is we would have randomly assigned facilities to be acquired. So once you say, okay, we will randomly assign facilities to acquire, then you describe what you actually did, which is the facilities are not randomly acquired. Then you realize that's a big problem. You need to do something about that. And you then have to think through what the threats to inferences are and how to address them. And then finally, when you're done, a thing that's often not done, and this goes back to what John said at the beginning about the fetishizing about p-values, people don't think about the interpretation of their results, their scale, their variability, etc. And I have to say, I actually took my name off of a paper once because the results, the financial impact of the result was so great, I couldn't believe it. And I think that thinking that through, are the results so small that we don't care, or they're so great that we shouldn't believe it? I think thinking that through and being clear about that in your own mind is very valuable. So reporting to readers, I've already mentioned this, comprehensible, cautious, conscientious, practical, post-publication reporting. And this is one of the reasons why I know Craig and talked about him, because he came and interviewed for a job, and we had a long conversation about his own work. He was very open, and it was a great experience. You may get contacted after you've published something. I think it's always wise to answer emails. If possible, you can post data and programs. I think you should try to keep your data around for 10 years. I'm getting to the point where that's now getting too old for some of my stuff, but so people call you up and say, hey, I'd like to do this. You should be able to give them the data. When there are critics, I think it is fair to engage them fairly. And I think looking at some of the recent examples, you'll see good practices and bad practices. Admit mistakes, fix problems as you go along. One last thing I want to point out is then there's reporting to our students. And we often forget our students. I brought this comic in to sort of indicate that the poor student is talking to the professor, and nowhere on the professor's list of important things is talking to the students. Whether we should be disclosing this uncertainty to students is, I think, a really big issue that I'm going to pause now. I'm going to stop now. We can talk about this if we want. But I think, how do we both provide education and admit the uncertainty we have in the education we're providing? I've been working on a course by that. I've gotten a lot of negative feedback from some colleagues, and I've got some doubts from an alums, and I'll just focus on this. There's a premium paid in early career post-MBA positions for fancy storytelling and some good market signals. Being wise enough to shrug in the face of data is not value. It's better to be wrong and confident than right, in which case perhaps then caution and being circumspect about your own research or research may not even be good, but that's a debate we can have. So at that moment, I'm happy to pause and take questions from whomever. I think I need to stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I especially want to say thank you for the minor mea culpas at the beginning. It's very nice, I think, for all of us to hear that you see some of these challenges in your own work, because that's certainly how I feel all the time. Now, I'm sure the challenges in mine are much greater than what you're dealing with. But from the time when I was a doctoral student all the way to now, where I, ostensibly from the outside, it seems like I might know what I'm doing. I'm very conscious of those sorts of issues. And so to hear somebody who's further along in the field to recognize some of the challenges in their own work, I think is very helpful for all of us. I don't think any of us in the field are good at saying that and looking at what's published. We generally like to look at that and say, well, that's fine. That's accepted by the journals. I don't ever have to think about it again.
Yeah.
But obviously it's an ongoing challenge.
But wouldn't that be a boring world? I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this is that there's a lot of resistance and frustration and angst about the criticism that is beginning to happen. But I think it is also could be one of the most exciting things. If we could have PhD students, for example, replicating and working on previous studies, what great training, what an exciting world. And yes, some high status people might discover their status is not quite so great, but I still think it's exciting.
This is why I always recommend keeping as low a status as possible.
Yeah.
You have nothing to lose then, everybody. So we'll open that up for questions. I'm sure there are a number of those. We'll put those in the chat. I'll ask the same question I did to Hans and to John. Now, a lot of your presentation was about the recommendations implicitly, but for people who are graduate students, are there any concrete suggestions that you would have, and particularly some things that maybe you didn't think about when you were at the stage of most of the participants that we have in the consortium?
Advice. Advice is, the problem is, right, so I am now a full professor at a university. So I can give you advice, but it's very contingent on the sense that in a weird way I've succeeded, by the standards. I don't have the counterfactual for what would have happened had I not followed this advice. So I don't know what inference I can really make. What I believe based on my own experience is that just trying, first of all, that everything we do has this moral struggle element. Because, even if we decide that, okay, I'm not going to run ex-ante models, or I'm not going to change hypotheses, or I'm not going to, modify variables or something, or I'm going to reduce the number of runs I have. That's always contingent on your interpretation. And one of the most impactful studies I did, we spent 2 months predicting the past and had the dependent variable where the sign flipped because we just goofed. And of course, those shouldn't be kind of included in a fishing kind of expedition. That was just an error. But so there's always this struggle, I think, of, am I lying? Am I being clear here? And I think trying to be as clear with yourself and your co-authors and your readers as you can, my belief is that will be good for you in the long run and good for science as well. I just find that when I'm not as clear as I can be, I waste a lot of time. So it's a moral struggle. We all got to work on it. Try to be as clear with yourself and others as you can be.
Okay, that's a very thoughtful answer. We have a couple of questions coming through now. Are you able to see the chat?
Yep.
Okay, I'll leave you to it.
Okay, so now I'm going to start top down. So the first one, that's a long question, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, is, oh boy, I'm going to have trouble with his name, Lelohanolo, on publication bias, can the quality of a research design enhance the value of a study in the eyes of the reviewers, assuming that the best methods were applied but happened to yield insignificant results? I believe that that is indeed happening. I hope, first of all, I think you should be armed whenever you write to a journal that the whole notion of p less than 0.05 as significant and non-significant is an artifact of history and is the wrong way to think about things. The notion that we have of a binary distinction between essentially confirmed and not confirmed is one of the problems I think we have to go over with. And Amy Cuddy is a great example of that. She had a significance of p less than 0.06, and then they hacked it a little bit to get a less than p less than 0.05. So ridiculous, because the meaning of that, there's no difference. So I think first, two things. I think, yes, research design is becoming more valuable at, say, journals like SMJ. And there are editors there that are more willing to believe that. So if you get an editor who's pushing back on you, then you should send an email to Alfonso or Rich Bettis and say, hey. The second thing is I think we should just push back on this idea of p less than 0.05 as significant versus non-significant. And there is a group of people out there who I think you have as allies. I would be one of them, and happy to help if you run into problems. But there's a whole group of grouchy, concerned academics who I think want to push this. So reach out and get help from people around. Okay, Brian Fox, what are your thoughts regarding pre-registration of studies through institutions like the Cochrane Collaboration? What are some of the benefits and costs of such device in the management field? You know, I have not done a pre-registration, so I don't know. I mean, the benefits seem clear to me that if you're doing new research that hasn't, for a theory that hasn't been hypothesized before, it constrains your ability to shift your hypotheses post hoc. I do wonder about how it's implemented, whether people kind of run pilot tests and then know what they're going to get and then register. I don't know. I really don't have great experience there. One thing I have wondered about is whether or not we should have a different standard for replications than we do for initial new theory. Because replications and tests of old theory, the hypotheses are essentially pre-registered, and maybe we have a different sort of expectation of inference value. But I'm sorry to say I'm going to whiff on this question. I just don't really know. What is your view of the application of Bayesian statistics in management research? Well, that's a very big question. So there is some application of Bayesian statistics already. One of the most common ones is with the concern about sample sizes. And you guys probably know Ed Leamer wrote a book many years ago, called Specification Searches. Ed Leamer is a Bayesian. And he basically made the argument that while you can get significance as you get very, very large sample sizes, the actual inferential value, the sort of how it's updating your priors, may be so small that it's not worth it. And so he created a Bayesian approach to significance that I and other people have used when you're running very large samples. I do think that that as we now move into a world where there's a lot of replication, that Bayesian statistics are going to become more important, because essentially we will be thinking about how the new study updates our prior that we have, and we'll have a measure for the prior. And if you think about what the p-hacking guys are trying to do, they're trying to figure out a way that we can say whether studies have inferential value. And that inferential value should be relative to a prior. And so I think I'm actually working right now on a way of thinking about p-hacking and p-distributions and how we should be thinking about that from a Bayesian point of view. So I think Bayes is going to become much more valuable as we move into a world of replication. Oh, Brian Fox said I had a great point. Thank you, Brian. I'm done, Craig. Nobody wants to talk to me.
There's one has just come in from Ting. I don't know if you can see that there. Many reviewers are huge believers about fixed effects. You see that?
Treated as a necessary trial on all sorts of models, including nonlinear models. Can you share your opinions? Oh, yeah. 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 So I don't exactly know which kind of nonlinear models you're talking about, but for example, I've often run into this problem that you have a limited dependent variable, it's 0, 1, and if you put in fixed effects, you're going to throw out all the people who, never had an event, and so that dramatically changes the sample size. Yeah. So there's no question that one of the problems we all face is that we have highly varying quality of reviewers, and we have highly varying interests of the reviewers. And it's not surprising. And I think for you guys who, if you're relatively new to the field, this has gotten worse. And my belief, the reason it's gotten worse is that the number of publications have gone up enormously at all the journals. And so the reviewer pool has then actually also had to be, you have to go deeper into the reviewer pool. So you have people who are less experienced doing reviews. And it is no doubt that you sometimes have to educate the reviewers on the method, and that this can be very frustrating. So I don't have a good answer for you other than you have to, my solution almost always is to try to outwork the reviewer. So you show them what happens with your sample size if you add in a fixed effect and how it's biasing things, and then you show them why this is a bad idea, and you write them back a letter with enormous numbers of tables in the back, and that's the goal. I can tell you though that didn't work. I went 4 rounds at management science on a paper where they wanted us to come up with a mechanism for connecting. We had a well-identified X variable and a Y variable. They wanted a moderating variable in the middle, a mediating variable in the middle, and they wanted us to show a causal connection, and we could not do it, and it wasn't, I don't think, even doable. We kept writing that back, and we eventually rejected after 4 rounds. Happens to everybody.
Well, on that very positive note, if you look at Professor King's Vita, you'll see that's a bit of an outlier.
No, it's not, Craig. I'm rejected. I'm rejected a lot. The person who I think I most admire for his multi-method approaches, his earnestness, his clarity, is Steve Klepper. And Steve Klepper told me that he was frequently rejected right up until his passing a few years ago. It's not, I don't think you should get discouraged by being rejected. The system is quite noisy. And again, this goes back to being true to yourself. If you think you're doing the right thing, keep going.
I want to emphasize that. Only 2 weeks ago, I had an R&R rejected at AMJ. So the little scar that you see here is from that. In the last 12 months, I've had 3 other papers rejected.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Craig.
Yeah, I've had a few things going a bit further, but yeah, the rejections, they happen, everybody. One final thing I just wanted to say about some of the points Andy was talking about. At SMJ, we are, I'm an AE there now, we are trying to do some of the sorts of things that in particular John and Andy were talking about. So we don't use stars anymore. You report p-values. The journal is now open to replications. So I do want to just let you all know about that.
Yes, but I have to point out that there's an interesting thing here that gets to our mental models, which is when they published this notion about not reporting p-values and reporting replications and so forth, one of the other things they said is, we will also publish, quote, non-findings. But that's wrong. Even if the p-value is 0.8, it's still a finding. There's still, the coefficient is the best estimate. That's got some variance to it, but it's a finding. So the whole notion, it goes back to, we still want to have that belief of there's true and there's false, and it's got to do with p less than 0.5. We got to get rid of that.
I feel maybe you need to visit your colleague down the hall. Need to tell Connie.
Yes.
Well, thank you again, everyone. If you would join with me in thanking Professor King in the chat for a fascinating discussion.
And thank you all for coming.
Hansen, and I don't think John has joined us again, but I think we'll wrap it up here. Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you at the same bat time, same bat channel next Wednesday morning.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Craig.
guys.
Bye-bye.